I used to lie awake in this sort of small room at the other end of the house, crying myself to sleep every night, really. And then I had this fantasy of just sneaking out in the middle of the night and just getting my bags and going. And then I'd remember the door was triple locked.
Imagine being 19 years old, living in a foreign country, and being trapped with a pedophile for 6 long months of your life, not quite knowing how you got into that situation or what to do about it. I'm Mia Friedman, and welcome to No Filter, a podcast series where I chat to people about their careers, their families, and their extraordinary lives. It's a one-on-one conversation with no filter, where nothing is off limits. And today's guest is a man I've admired for a very long time, and he has had an unusual and pretty unorthodox and at times very painful childhood. Richard Glover is the author of 12 books. His hilarious weekly columns have been published in the Sydney Morning Herald for over 20 years, and he also presents the top-rating drive show on ABC Radio in Sydney. Today, he reveals with brutal honesty and unrelenting humour a life of dealing with uninterested parents, the darkness of being groomed by pedophiles, and the light he found with his wife, Debra Oswald, and 2 children, Dan and Joe. It's a tale about the resilience of humans and the imperfect art of parenting. Rich has written a brilliant new book. It's a memoir, his first, called Flesh Wounds. Richard Glover, welcome.
Thank you.
To No Filter. Now, I imagine you've got quite a good filter after all these years of being on radio.
Of what I shouldn't say.
What you shouldn't say. Yeah, you don't let things just slip out.
Poo.
We see now you're on the No Filter podcast. You can really let it all hang out. You're not shackled by the ABC anymore.
That's right.
I want you to tell me. Your book is magnificent, by the way. I love everything you write, but this is very, very special and very, very heartfelt, and it's a different style of writing from you than I've ever read, except for that piece that you wrote that sparked it all off for the Good Weekend.
Well, it's ripped direct from my heart. But it does have jokes in it, I suppose, like my other writing. But I think the jokes are a form of defiance, really.
I've always had that sense with you. I've always had that sense that you keep the world a little bit out there. And I suppose part of it is probably being an ABC journalist. You're not allowed to give too many opinions in your job. But I also felt, I won't say, the tears of a clown or whatever, the opposite. It's almost a defence, like jokes as a self-defence mechanism. And I've got little glimpses of it. For example, I remember you talking on radio, and you've written in your book about a game that you like to play called Who Has the Weirdest Parents? Mm-hmm. Tell me about that.
Well, I recommend it as a great thing for the end of any dinner party. Is you just sort of gather your friends around the table, prize of wine to the victor, and you just invite everyone to compete in the competition who's got the weirdest parents, and each person can tell a story about their parents' oddity. And what's so interesting about the game is you never, having played it with anybody really, the most boring, normal-looking group of people, there'll be tales of such staggering, frothing insanity, you won't be able to believe it. And having played the game, you never look at the red roofs of suburbia ever again and imagine there's anything other than, as I say, screaming oddity beneath them. And especially funny, I think, is there'll always be someone at the table who'll demur and say, look, that sounds fun, but you'll have to skip me because my parents are so boring and ordinary. And you'll say, oh, come on, Steve or Eric or Belinda or whatever. You must have some story to tell. And they'll say, oh, well, I guess unless you mean ... And then they'll, I remember one particular instance of a friend saying exactly that. I can't. And then he said, unless you mean, I guess the way my father, it was a bit strange, the way my father couldn't bear my mother touching his underwear in any way, so he built a whole laundry in the garage, and when he'd come home from work and he'd park his car and he'd launder all his own underwear through the dryer. Unless you mean something like that.
That's not weird at all.
Everyone would say, yes, exactly.
You win.
Yeah.
Game over.
Yeah.
What are some of the stories you tell when that game's played?
Well, I think the weird thing about me is I often don't win. And yet, I think my story is pretty good. And the book explores this in more detail, obviously. But the basic gist of my bid to win Who's Got the Weirdest Parents is usually my mother, who always claimed that I was the first artificial insemination baby in Australia. This is back in the late...
Quite the achievement.
Yeah, she's not talking about anything special. She's not talking about IVF or anything like that. She's talking turkey baster. She's talking about the old technology. And I have checked this out, and it's reasonably plausible that it might be true. It's the reason she gave for me being the first artificial insemination baby in Australia that is truly odd, which is that she refused to sleep with my father ever, that the marriage was not consummated. And even in the late 50s, you had to have sex to get pregnant.
You did. You did.
And so that was the reason.
And was that true?
I think it possibly was. My mother was a bit of a she a fantasist. And so you have to distrust some of her stories a little. But my father wasn't, and I remember checking it with my father, and his version of the story was almost identical. He said they were living in New Guinea, and he said she had never slept with him. The marriage was unconsummated for 12 years, but they wanted to have a child. So according to my father, they came down to Sydney, they saw the gynaecologist, they attempted the procedure, and according to her, it worked. So, she was pregnant.
Immaculate conception.
If you want to call me Jesus.
I will.
That's perfect fine. According to my father, it didn't work, and so they went back to New Guinea, and she was forced to sleep with him.
As a last resort.
Just the once to have me. So whichever story is true, it's hard to think of myself as a love child.
And so why did he stay with her? Because she wasn't gay. She wasn't... she didn't have some sort of physical problem. She went on to have a very healthy sex life and, in fact, run off with your English teacher. So why did
Which is another bid, surely, in Who's Got the Weirdest Parent.
That would go down very
well. Ran off
well
with my English teacher.
Yeah.
Who she met at parent-teacher, which somehow makes it worse.
And you write in the book about feeling so... sort of proud and pleased by the way this teacher singles you out for special attention, for coaching, and how the difference that makes to you, and how it wasn't until years later you realised that...
Hang on, wait a minute.
Yeah. At the time, you said you were like 11th in the class, so you weren't like the genius, but you weren't the lowest in the class. So there wasn't really an explanation for it other than that.
And yet you never think about that at the time.
No.
It is funny, I think, thinking back on your life, how it often takes decades to figure out what the bleeding obvious. And the bleeding obvious in that case, I think, was that, yes, it was an unwitting gangplank to my mother. That he'd offered me this special tutoring on Saturday mornings. It's the kids who come 11th in the class that I really want to help. It didn't make sense. And we did, I think what's so particularly obnoxious about it is the care he'd taken in setting the trap, which is that we started off with Shakespeare, and we spent a couple of weeks on Shakespeare. And then Shakespeare led, because it's a similar period, to Samuel Pepys, who wrote his famous diary about the Great Fire of London in 1666 or whenever it was. And after we've done a couple of weeks on Pepys's diary naturally leads to the diary form, and maybe I would like to write a diary about my home life and bring it in every week, and maybe he would take it away and mark it, and as I say, even once my mother had soon after my mother ran away with him. It really wasn't until I think I was about 40 when I thought, oh, yes, I was in them. Well, Samuel Pepys, and then hang on a minute.
Wow. Because you don't think about things through that lens at that age.
No, that's right. It's so obvious, really. Anyway, so so that's part of the story, I suppose, is her thing with my father and then running off with the English teacher, and me being, as I mentioned, Jesus, the Immaculate Conception. The other part of the story, though, again, my pitch for Who's Got the Weirdest Parents, is that she always claimed to be from this aristocratic background. She was English, and she claimed that, her father worked for Sir Winston. At other times the father seemed to have been in the Raj and been in India running things and all that sort of stuff. And I never really focused on that story much, to be honest, but it was she always told these stories. And then when I was 19, I did what lots of Australians do when they're 19. I decided to go and visit overseas, and I would go and see the family. And so I got the names and addresses of my father's relatives from him, and then I rang up my mother in where she'd moved to. She'd run off with the English teacher to some town far north, and I rang her up, and she said, "Oh no, I couldn't give you the names and addresses of your relatives." And again, she kind of repeated the story which I'd partly heard, which was that there were such aristocratic people. They'd sent her to boarding school at age 5, and she understood that that's what that class of people did. But nonetheless, it was because it was a terrible thing for her, and it was really by being locked up in that posh boarding school till she was 16 that she sort of ended up running off with my father, and all the disasters of that ensued. And she sort of blamed her parents for the terrible marriage and all of that. So she wouldn't give me their addresses. So I thought, oh, well, fair enough. And so I go to England, obviously anyway, and go and see my father's sister, and she's delightful, and I've got 3 cousins I'm meeting for the first time and all of that. And after I'm there for a while, my auntie says, "Oh, you'll be going now and seeing your mother's side of the family." And I said, "Oh, no, Auntie Audrey, because, she, our aristocratic family, worked for Sir Winston and, posh boarding school, ran off with my father, New Guinea, turkey baster, me."
Jesus.
So she doesn't want me to go and see these dreadful people who began this. And through all of this, my auntie's sort of smiling a little bit, curiously, oddly, and she says, "Would you like to see a picture of your mother and her sisters?" And I think, sisters? Because she always told me she was an only child of and that I was the only only child of an only child was one of her great customary phrases. And I said, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure." And so my auntie goes upstairs in this little house of hers in Bristol, or near Bristol, and I hear her rummaging around in the cupboards, and she comes down with one of those tiny little black and white photographs they used to have, and she hands this to me, and I stare at it transfixed, because it's a picture of clearly my mother. I could recognise her, 2 sisters who have quite similar appearance, and these 2 parents, and they look northern working class. I mean, they look northern working class as rendered by Monty Python. I mean, the father virtually has a hanky on his head. I mean, they look lovely, but they're certainly not aristocratic
or working for Winston Churchill.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I said to my auntie, "Oh, well, they look lovely." And she says, "Well, they were lovely, but your mother was embarrassed by them and was trying to escape her class, so much so that she wouldn't let them come to the wedding. And they came anyway and stood in the rain throwing confetti."
That broke my heart, that description. And it's not until years later that you go back and try to unpick all of that.
Yeah, and part of the book is trying to go back and find the truth of it, and why did she deny the sisters? And I think the other little bit of kind of debate in the book, I suppose, is what to make of this. I mean, I never challenged her about it. I never challenged her about it.
Why didn't you?
I think partly because I didn't know. Well, partly because I didn't care. I mean, and a lot of the book is about, can you hold, when you've got slightly toxic parents, can you hold them at arm's length? Do you have, the popular psychology is you have to make your peace with them.
And confront them and
so
resolve it.
Part of it is a debate about that. Another part of the book, I think, is a debate about her. Is there something? The British class system is a terrible thing. It's a thing that pigeonholes people and tells working class people to stay in their place. Maybe there is something heroic about a woman who denies her, just walks away from that past, comes to the other side of the world, pretends to be something different, puts on this posh, ridiculous voice, talks about lavatories and serviettes and sofas and spectacles and all that. Maybe there's something heroic about that. On the other hand, maybe it is so self-lacerating to cut off your sisters, deny their very existence, deny your own, change your name, change your past, as she did, that you render yourself unable to love my father, unable to love me, only able to love the English teacher later on. So that's the other part of the book, is what do you make of what she did?
How old were you when she left, when she ran off with the teacher?
15.
And you really describe, with humour and also just so much sort of in incredibly poignant ways, a childhood of sort of benevolent neglect, really.
Yeah.
From both your parents. Your father was a big drinker. Your mother was very much caught up with her fantasy world and who she was pretending to be.
But, I don't think any of this is... And the book is not about... it's not Angela's Ashes. It's not about some
it's not.
Terrible, terrible childhood. And part of the thing of who's got the weirdest parents is I think it's a really common story. Maybe not in its detail. Maybe some of the detail is a bit... a bit eccentric. When she goes away there's a long chapter, which is kind of my favourite, I suppose, about once she goes off with the English teacher, they live in this hobbit. They're obsessed with Tolkien, and they live in this kind of nudist hobbit
with teddy bears.
So some of the details are eccentric, but I think that the main point of the book really is that all this is really commonplace. The benevolent neglect is quite common, actually. People criticise today's parents for being helicopter parents, and it actually annoys the hell out of me because, and they paint this picture of the 50s and the 60s and maybe the 70s as being this wonderful freewheeling childhood in which these incredibly intelligent, sensitive parents understood that their children needed to roam in the woods and so would allow them the necessary freedom to grow.
As if it was a choice and a proactive decision.
Exactly. And by contrast, today's parents are these terrible helicopter parents who are restricting and confining their children. And I just don't see it that way. And certainly, I think there were some advantages in growing up when we did, and there's some disadvantages of growing up now. But one of the difference is not this intention of the parents. In the 60s and 70s, they were just often quite uninterested in their children. You would fit in with their needs and their desires. They were quite inattentive. Would often... This is the time when a kid's Saturday afternoon would commonly involve sitting in the Valiant outside a pub, and if your father remembered your existence, he would bring you out a lemonade. That was the good father who halfway through the drinking session would bring out the kids a lemonade. You never... This whole business of parents and grandparents now going to soccer or netball or something like that and watching that really... And this is, I'm not saying that this was absolutely... There weren't... I'm sure there were some parents who did that back then. But my story, I think, is absolutely the common one, which is that you would cycle on your push bike to the school sport or the district sport. You would play the game of rugby league or AFL or netball or whatever it was. Then you would cycle home, and maybe if you again had very interested parents, sometime in the afternoon someone might think to say, "Did you win?"
Yeah.
Now that is the common experience. So there's a whole industry at the moment about
free range parenting.
There's a whole industry about painting this sort of rosy picture of a 60s childhood. And yet, the reality was that there were dangers about that childhood because of the inattention of the parents. It meant that there was no bond of trust between parent and child, which meant that if you did go into the woods and you did find a pedophile, and there were pedophiles in the woods, that there was no bond of trust between the children and the parents to share that fact, to express it. It meant that there was none of that kind of closeness. Again, I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but I think a lot of the point of my story is not that this was particularly weird. This is a common story.
Quite symptomatic of the time.
It's a quite common story, and I think the other point of the story is that, I survived this, and most of us survive it. So again, this is not a kind of self-lacerating misery memoir. It's really about saying most of us had some of these problems. As I say, the eccentric details are different from what the father who washes his own underwear through to my mother with her Tolkien obsession. But, most people, or maybe not most people, here's what I say in the book, that if you talk to a group of your friends... Let me start again. We have this whole language about maternal and paternal love. We say it's inexorable. It's in its DNA. Everyone deserves the love of a mother and father. We even talk about it being sort of deep in the animal kingdom. We talk about cats with their kittens and cows with their calves. And we end up talking ourselves into the idea that if you didn't get absolute perfect maternal and paternal love, then that's pretty odd and pretty different, and you'd be warranted to be very alarmed about that. In fact, you'll probably go totally insane. And here's an interesting experiment. Talk to a group of your friends and ask them this question. Did you get the sort of maternal and paternal love you would want to give your own child? Now, I reckon that maybe 60% will say yes, actually. They'll say, no, well, look, my parents weren't perfect, of course, but yes, they did give me the sort of love that I would want to give a child of my own. But I warrant that maybe 40% will say, you know what, I didn't. I didn't get the love that I'd want to give my own child. And yes, it is deeply built into our DNA that mothers and fathers love their children, but there are so many barriers to the effective delivery of that love. You know, there's a father who's lost his job and become totally depressed. There's a mother who's taking pills. There's alcoholism. There's gambling. If it doesn't sound too grand, in my case, maybe it was the British class system was the barrier to the effective delivery of that love.
Mental illness comes into it too.
And yet, yeah, that's right. And yet, here's the thing: most of us are not self-destructive and mad and drug addicted and suicidal. Most of us aren't. And this is the amazing resilience of human beings. And that really is what what I hope the end point of the book is that we are amazingly resilient, and most of us somehow find the love elsewhere. And in this book, there's lots of points where I find the love elsewhere. And the book is partly about finding the love elsewhere.
Most notably in Debra, your partner.
Yes.
And your sons, Dan and Joe.
And maybe also in the New Guinea nanny who
Yes.
looked after me for the first 3.5 years and never put me down.
Yeah.
You know, parented me in that bonded New
And
Guinea
unexpected
way.
people on the way, like when after your mother leaves, your father leaves too.
Yeah.
Which, as you write, one of your friends says, Richard never really left home. Home left him.
He only went for a while. But yes, he did go too. And my friends loved coming round to this. Again, this is not Angela's Ashes. It's quite a nice house. It's got a pool.
Yeah, exactly. But still, it's an odd thing to happen when you're a
Yeah.
teenager, that both your parents just decide to leave for their own,
Yes,
without considering the needs of you.
Yeah, and then a little while later, my father moved. He was still in England, but he moved a friend of his, an old newspaper friend from New Guinea. He moved into the house.
Who you talk about being very formative and
Yeah.
giving
So
you-
his name is Steve Stevens. Isn't that great?
Yeah,
Isn't that a great
yeah.
sort of old journo name? But he was a great figure in my life, and partly I think he answered questions in me that I had partly about masculinity.
what it means to be a man.
Yeah, growing up in the 70s in Canberra was a sort of somewhat weird place, I think, because on one hand you had the normal Australian culture of the time, which was very limited in terms of roles for young men. It had attitudes to sport I didn't share, attitudes to women I didn't like, attitudes to drinking. Well, that I've been working on ever since, but but in rejecting all that, there was then this alternative extreme view around at the time, which I suppose I was exposed to. I went to Canberra Youth Theatre, which was really, this is early feminist co-op theatre, really, and there was a kind of strange attitude to masculinity, that masculinity was a dangerous thing. It was really a code word for rape. I mean, this was the time that the Australian Union of Students at the time actually passed a resolution saying that, essentially that all men had to be considered rapists and were part of a rape culture. And then there was a fantastic debate about how do you define a man then, because little boys, and they decided at age 7, you should be considered
a man,
a rapist,
and
therefore a rapist.
Wow!
Welcome to your 7th birthday.
Yeah.
So it was a weird, it was a kind of weird culture, and you felt that. I mean, just to give one example of the time, just to show how zany it was, I really strongly have because a little theatre company, so you have rostrum. Whatever they're called, little bits of stage that you have to. And I remember one of the young women, so we were all kind of 16 or something, saying to Felix and I, "Can you two men move that over there?" And everything stopped. We stopped. She stopped. She instantly saw the error of her ways. She apologised. She'd called us men. she'd used the word men, which to our ears and to her ears was really, well, it was pretty demonising.
Wow. So you were looking
and then
for...
she said, you Felix
Fellas.
and Richard, fellas or something.
Guys.
Yeah, or something, yeah.
So you had to find what it meant to be a man through all of this.
Yeah, and I think
you had to learn.
Yes, and so Steve, the guy who comes in and looks after me after they're both gone, he is this sort of great image of an old Aussie, blokey, but passionate guy. So he goes hunting and shooting, fishing, which he takes me on. But he also reads poetry. He's intensely loyal about his wife, intensely loyal to my father, intensely loyal to me too. So I still have this little thing where, he would insist on driving me places if I had to go somewhere, and I always say, "Oh no, don't, you shouldn't do that," and he'd say, "No," and get me into the car, and he'd say, and I'd thank him again, and he said, "Son, it's just turning a wheel." It's just turning a wheel. And I still, all through my son's childhood, when I gave them lifts and their friends lifts, and some kid would thank me, and I'd say, son, and I wouldn't explain the reference, of course, but it was my way of thanking Steve's
legacy
across the decades. And I'd just say, it's just turning a wheel.
You talk about, though, in your teenage years, you were a vulnerable kid, and you said that you allude to the fact that pedophiles are drawn to vulnerable kids. They can sniff when there's no strong parental role model.
It's not properly dated, is it? What's it called in a film when you have the thing that doesn't fit in with the time? But I say it's like they're on a text alert. I know we didn't
they're
have
on a text alert. Yeah,
I know we
exactly.
didn't have text alerts then, but that's right. And I think
because Steve, even you telling that story about I was in the car with Steve, like there's an ominousness about that now that it could have gone the other way. Steve could have been a predator.
Yeah, well, he wasn't.
He wasn't.
He was fantastic. But
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there are predators, and I suppose that's the other part of the story is that when parents are uninterested, as I think so many of them were, that there are kind of dangers for the vulnerable. And I got into certain trouble at that point, and then I got into a really lot of trouble later on when I went to that visit when I went to England after I'd seen my auntie for a while. I got into a lot of trouble, and that's probably it's one of the bleak chapters in the book, I suppose.
It's extraordinarily bleak and shocking, but you write about it with, I won't say a detachment, but almost a deft of hand. Like you write about it quite lightly, that in a way that probably betrays the depth of impact that it had on you.
Well, I don't think it dominates.
It's a tiny part of the book.
No. It's also it doesn't. I suppose that's another way of saying it doesn't dominate my life, and that's again a kind of important thing to say. I suppose I want to write a memoir that's got some misery in it, but it's also got some defiance to it. Yeah. Some defiance to it, and that some of these. And I'm not saying that these things are survivable for everybody, and I understand that they're not. But I think for a lot of people, you do, as I say, find the love elsewhere. You can survive these things. That was a terrible thing. That was a terrible 6 months of my life, and I hope I describe how terrible it was, but I also really strongly don't believe it defines who I am. It might define some aspects of my character, actually, but I, and I think it's also important to say that it also grows out of the neglect. That's the other thing I suppose I want to say is that I think obviously we blame pedophiles for being pedophiles, but the pedophile doesn't necessarily operate in a vacuum, and it is important to share the blame. I don't know, but it is important to say that the vulnerability is part of what's happening as well.
Making them an easier target.
Exactly.
What rang out so strongly from me reading that chapter about when you were 19 and you were in London and you were trapped in this weird sort of sexual, emotionally abusive relationship with this much older man. As someone who's been through an emotionally abusive relationship, you write almost with bewilderment and you look back and you go, it's hard to explain why I was there, why I stayed for 6 months. I was legal. I could have called the police. I could have walked out the door.
Yeah.
And how do you look back and understand that, make sense of that time now?
Well, I think the wisdom I can offer on that is that one of the things that pedophiles do is they run down your they run down your self-esteem, and that's their modus operandi, really. So you arrive.
Anyone who's going to abuse you runs down your self-esteem.
Yeah. So you arrive in my case already vulnerable, and he kind of whizzes you into this kind of terrible antique-ridden prison, and he first, and then it's a combination of things. He he runs you down, and whenever you kind of suggest things, there's a kind of putting you down. So your self-esteem gets lower and lower. Your money supplies get lower and lower too, because he puts you off applying for jobs. So you find you find a lad in the stage to go and sell tickets at Jesus Christ Superstar or something. So no, you shouldn't do that. That's a bad part of town, or he'll find some. So part of the story is you just get poorer and poorer until you're dependent, because he talks you out of going anywhere or doing anything,
and kept promising jobs.
Yes, and then there's actually then an appeal to. He says, "Oh no, I'll get you a better job. I'll get you a job as a coffee boy at the TV station." And so that's my dream. I aimed low and missed. So and I say in the book, I think in the end, as I add it all up, he appealed to my. And he'd also sort of look at you with these bug eyes and say, "Oh, don't leave,"
Yeah,
so he appealed to my good side, my bad side. He ran me down. He appealed to my ambitious side. So all these things happen, and I used to lie awake in this sort of small room at the other end of the house, crying myself to sleep every night, really, and fantasizing about. What I would say to him, because very dominant person, and I'll say I've decided to go to Scotland. I've decided to go back to see my aunt. I've decided, and then understanding that if I said it to him, he would somehow talk me out of it and put me down, and that I wouldn't be able to muster the courage to go through with it. And then I had this fantasy of just sneaking out in the middle of the night and just getting my bags and going. And then I'd remember the door was triple locked every night.
Wow.
So, there's...
Yeah, that's chilling when you talk about that.
Again, there's a number of kind of layers to it. But I did escape in the end.
You did escape, and I want to, your mum was your unlikely hero, wasn't she,
exactly.
coming to your rescue.
And
she showed unusual for her insight into what was going on. She came in and she read the situation very quickly, and she helped get you out of there. But at that time,
I think
still,
I'd lost
there was
a lot.
no...
I think I lost a lot of weight. I was looking very kind of...
and there was still no...
pale and wan,
Did you ever go back and say those things to him that you wanted to say, or did you ever feel like you went back and...
No. No. So I haven't confronted a lot of things, have I?
No.
I keep on walking away from things. But you see, I suppose part of... And
writing about
again,
was that a difficult thing to write about?
This is one of the things about the book is I have a sense to... and again, I know this flies in the face of a lot of contemporary psychology about confronting things. But I confront them in the book. But in terms of confronting people in my life... I've always had this strong sense that parts of my life have gone really extremely well. So maybe I didn't have the parents that you would order off the catalogue. But I've had other things that have been extremely wonderful. So I've had a really fantastic partner from very early age, from 20, who I've now been with for 35 years. And I've got 2 wonderful children. I've got a lot of good friends. I've got quite a good job. So I think part of life for me has been to try to concentrate on the things that have been nourishing and good, and just hold at arm's length some of the things that haven't been so good, to concentrate on the good things. Part of the book is a meditation, I suppose, on to what extent that's possible. And when we go to England, there's later on in the book, there's moments when maybe that starts to crack open for me a little bit. But it's still an open question, I think, at the end of the book, of how much utility is necessarily gained by inviting intimacy with people who might not be ideal for that purpose.
You say, you're right, I'd met bad in the world and I'd met good, and good had the louder voice.
Well, that was about Steve Stevens,
Yeah.
That's
and
right.
you also say the doors that close determine your path in life as much as those that open. And that, I think you wrote about things not working out in London. And you coming back to Australia.
Yeah, I think again, this is not special to me, and I think this is a thing for most people, is that at the time you have these disasters, but when you look back at it from when you're a bit older and you look back at your life, you of course see all those failures as necessary to providing you end up with something that you like in your life. All those failures are the necessary closed doors that lead you to where you are. So you look back at them, and in this case, he did get me a job. The evil Lionel did get me a job in the end as a coffee boy at the television station. And I think they had about 6 coffee boys. They did the clapper boards and all that sort of stuff. And nearly every summer holidays, out of the 6, one would not have returned. And so there was an expectation I'd probably get a permanent job as the coffee boy. And this particular summer, they all came back. And so the coffee boy job lasted for 2 weeks, and then I was back with the hideous Lionel. And in the end, I fought out, and I had a quite good time in England for 6 months. And then I came back to Australia, and pretty rapidly actually. Again, I was trying to follow my dream of getting a job in which I'd be allowed to serve coffee to actors. And again, that didn't work out in Australia either. So I went to university very reluctantly, really, to just really park myself somewhere whilst I continued this dream. And then over the next year or two, lots of things happened. Because of all these failures, I ended up just concentrating on the university studies for want of something better to do, and found that I actually really liked it, and I was actually quite good at academic work, and the more work you did, the more enjoyable it was, and you get onto a sort of a snowball effect where I ended up being a very dutiful student. I did a history honours degree and
met Debra.
And I met Debra.
That's really been. Reading the book, she's been the twin to your mother in terms of the two defining women in your life, and they could not be more polar opposite, and the effect and the relationship they've had to you could not be more opposite.
And I think a lot of the comedy of the book is the relationship between the two of them too.
Yeah, I love that. Her loyalty. I mean, obviously your partner is Debra Oswald, who is an extraordinarily accomplished novelist and screenwriter, most famous for writing and conceiving of offspring. But the way you each talk about each other when I've spoken to you, I love, like, your eyes light up when you talk about her and hers about you. And, you talk beautifully about your courtship and how your relationship starts as friends, and then you try to have a crack, but she's got a boyfriend, and over the years, and then it fires up. And you talk about, you wrote each other these long letters when you moved to Sydney, and she was still in Canberra, I think. And there's one extract in a letter that she wrote to you, and she said, I repeat for that. She's talking about some problems that she's having and some self-doubt. And she says, I repeat for the 100th time, you must help me bolster my spirits, Richard, and I'll bolster yours. And that sung out to me as such an perfect encapsulation of your relationship.
Yeah.
And the opposite of what you had with your parents.
We're on the same team, yeah.
Yeah, you're on the same team. And that experience must have been very revelatory and very new for you.
Well, I think there's a moment I describe in the book, that falling in love moment, I suppose, when I think I'd always, and look, there's still some of this in me, but I'd always had this very frayed sense of self, I suppose, and in which, and again, I think this grows out of that childhood, but is again not particularly uncommon, which is a sense that you're hovering above yourself. You're not within your own body. You're constantly doubting yourself and watching yourself as if you're in a film of your own life and you're playing a character called you, and there's a kind of distance between the character and yourself. And this is obviously at times of crisis, like when you're in the pedophile hangout with Lionel, there's that sense. But I think there's also, I also had that sense when I was walking down the street. Here am I walking down the street. here I am going to the news agency. And one of the strongest memories I have of when I really fell for Debra was, and I can still see the room, and it's in her friend Andrea's flat in Braddon in Canberra, and she's got a mantelpiece and there's candles on it. She's having a little party, and Debra's standing in front of the mantelpiece, and so this is a bit corny, isn't it? But she's haloed in light.
No.
And there's this sort of moment that I still can remember really vividly, of feeling suddenly that I was entering my own body.
Wow.
That I'd come back into my own body. And I was sort of standing looking at her through my own eyes.
And I feel like you've never lost that, really. Yeah.
Oh, dear.
That's incredibly... Oh, no.
Can you filter out that bit, please?
Sure.
No filter
Okay.
podcast.
No filter. Filter a bit. You talk about seeing your parents differently when you have children for the first time yourself.
Yeah.
And how people say, how did you learn to parent? How did you... you always had such a bad model. And you talked about, I watched Debra a lot. But I think that's selling yourself short.
Yeah, maybe. I never had problems with it, because a lot of people say, again, one of these senses of if you haven't been parented right. See, I think this is the centre of the book, really.
Yes,
is to say to people, there's a sense in our culture, if you haven't been parented right, you're stuffed. You're stuffed from there. There's no way out from that. Everyone deserves that. If you haven't had it, bad luck, you're stuffed. You can't be a parent yourself. You can't be happy yourself. And so the book is a kind of... And the role of the jokes in the book actually are a defiant refusal to accept that.
But they're very emblematic of you, of your spirit and of your humour.
Yeah, but I think in literary terms, if this is not too fancy, that's what the jokes are there for, is to say, yeah, you don't have to accept that, though. You can be quite defiant about that, and you can kind of whack this bad childhood with gags and beat it into submission, and certainly you can parent. This idea that you can't parent, okay, I had the advantage of Debra, who always was a very switched on parent. And so, but I don't know if I needed that. I responded to it very directly.
Instinctively.
Yeah, and I think, but the odd thing was, I suppose, yes, you do get that. You do get a fresh perspective on your own parents. I suppose that the bit in the book where this is sharpest is, and there's a scene where my younger child has just been born, so he's 10 days old. This is Joe, and my mother's down in Sydney for some business thing, and she's sitting on our couch and having a cup of tea for a moment, and I say, and I've got Joe in my arms, and I say, "Would you like to hold the baby, Mum?" And she says, "No, I couldn't." And I said, that tone of voice you use when you're trying to pretend that everything's normal, your family's normal, your mother's normal, nothing to look at here. that jolly hockey sticks voice. You say, "Oh, come on, Mum, you must have held me." And I kind of lean towards her, on my toes with the baby outstretched towards her. And she says, after a moment, she's sort of furiously shaking her head, she says, "I never did. The natives did it."
How did that make you feel?
Well, it's weird, isn't it? And
did it cut you, or were you beyond that with her? You talk about your feelings for her being very much in quarantine.
Yeah. I think that was it's quite a weird idea of whether that's literally true, or she wants it to be true, or maybe she's just so obsessed with germs she doesn't want to touch the child.
Why wouldn't you lie?
Yeah. Why would
even if it was true?
Well, and I think there is certainly some truth in it. That the natives did it.
The natives did it.
Because my father was an enthusiastic photographer. He was a newspaper man. And there are lots of photographs of this first 3 or 4 years of my life in New Guinea. And in almost all of them, I'm being held by Darnota.
There's a beautiful picture on the back of the book.
They're lovely. And she's gorgeous. And she's got a husband who's called Gogo, who's in a lot of the pictures too. And there's these sort of fantastic, quite formal photographs of this couple, him bare-chested, Papua New Guinean warrior, really, and her with this sort of black, crinkled beehive hair. And they are holding their little European baby. It's like a family scene.
It's very funny.
And I think... And the pictures do seem to tell that story. That yes, of course, she held me. There's a picture on the cover of the book where she's holding me my mother's holding me, but that 99% of the pictures
She's
Darnota's
not.
holding. And there's a weird story that they'd always told me. I love family stories. How I think they're the best wisdom or the best information in family stories is the information that is not that the person is not trying to impart, but simply falls out of the story when they're unwrapping it for another purpose. And so there's a story she tells me about their dog, who is a terrific dog. And she's always told me this story. And when I was 1 year old, the dog, jealous about my arrival in the household, gets me by the head and nearly kills me, and the dog has to be put down. And it's a tragic story about her favourite dog being put down, is the way she tells the story. And the obvious question, which I asked once I was 13 or 14, was, well, if it was jealous, why did it wait till I was 1 year old to mount its attack? And the answer to that is, because Darnota never put you down. So, and this is quite traditional in Papua New Guinea culture, that it's close physical bonding of mothers and babies, and so she would have held me and carried me almost all the time, and so it wasn't until over a year that she put me down on the ground for the first time.
And then the dog took a go.
And
then
that's when the dog has to go. So that's kind of an interesting little aspect of the story.
Surely...
And I think, when you think of how well formed a child is by the time the child is 3 or 4.
Attachment. They talk about attachment, relying on that early time.
I know. So it's another curious part of the story, isn't it? That
she saved you,
yeah,
didn't she?
maybe to the extent that I have got some self-confidence amid my self-doubts. It was probably given to me by this woman, I only know the first name of. There's no way to contact. She lives in, she's from another part of the world.
And also your ability to love and show affection, even if it wasn't demonstrated to you in living memory.
Yeah,
it's still, you felt loved and secure and cherished.
It's in your cell memory.
It's in your DNA.
Yeah,
it's in your cell memory.
So maybe to the extent that I'm a good father, I owe it to Darnota and Gogo.
You say, I hoped I'd given them, your sons, by some proportion, large or small, more love than I'd received. And then you go on to express some doubt about that. I mean, your son, I heard him yesterday as a guest on your show. He's followed in your footsteps, and he's a radio announcer is he in Darwin? No, somewhere rural.
He's in Horsham, rural Victoria.
Okay, rural Victoria. And I'm not sure what Joe's done, but he's just left school, left home.
He's a young junior architect.
Okay, and you've got an empty nest now. And Debra tells me that, I think, I told you, the best part about having an empty nest is that you and she can now have sex all over the house.
I did see she'd disclosed that to you.
Speaking of no filter. So congratulations on that.
On the sex, exactly.
On the sex, well done. Good times for you. But how can you, I hear the way you talk about your sons. I hear them talking to you on the radio. How can you have any doubt that they are anything other than loved, and that you are anything other than a magnificent father?
Look, I guess,
and partner.
Well, I guess you just I say I'm a good father, and then I say my hands hesitate to type the phrase.
I suppose someone else has to say that about you.
Yeah,
don't they?
That's right. I think you always have doubts.
Yeah, true.
Because it's an imperfect art, isn't it?
True.
Parenting, and it's always this balance between being too involved in their lives and not involved enough. And, again, this gets back to the whole discussion of helicopter parents and my frustration with the way that modern parents are demonised about that, even though it seems so obvious to me when I look at these gorgeous young people, my sons and their friends, and they're all so fantastic, and they talk with such beautiful respect about their parents, and they've all had these parents who were helicopter parents, I guess, in the sense that they went to soccer and they paid an interest and they loved their children and they
didn't leave.
And they didn't leave, and and they've now got these much more bonded relationships with their parents. They talk about their parents so beautifily into
and it's a friendship
their 20s.
That you've now seen that you can have with your adult sons.
That's right.
Your father passed away a few years ago.
Yeah.
Your mother, is she still in care? She's in a nursing home with dementia.
She's really deeply lost in dementia, which I suppose gives me the opportunity to write the book. I don't know that I could without that being the case. Although, you've read the book, tell me, but I think the book is very fair, and especially once we get to England. And
you're fairer to her than I think I wanted to be.
And also I think once we get to the one little part of the book, which is a little detective story, is once we get to England, and through a lot of talking and document research, we find the truth
Some
about
insights.
Why she left.
And you show enormous compassion for her.
Yeah, and there is stuff in there which makes sense.
Do you still see her?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
You've got.
Yeah.
Is she up in Noosa still?
Yeah, that's right. But it's one of those things where it's, even if I mention the English teacher or something, these things that have been important, she doesn't really.
She's lost.
She's lost. You can, of course, you can talk to her, yes, she's lost.
The other thing that I was going to say, and I sort of wanted to finish with this, is you talk about not, being able to survive and triumph over, shitty childhoods, large or small.
Limp forward into the future.
Yeah,
maybe not
hardly.
triumph.
But you could have grown up hating women. You really could have. You didn't, but you really, to me, you're one of the greatest feminists I know. You are incredibly insightful when it comes to the way women think and feel.
Maybe Canberra Youth Theatre was good.
It must have been. I guess that's... I can't just say that's all, Debra, but the partnership that you two have, one that you've never formalised with marriage.
No.
Are you waiting until gays and lesbians can
Well, that's right. Or
marry?
Maybe she should ask me. I don't know. No, I think...
Why haven't you?
I think because... I think the honest answer to that is I think, my image of marriage was formed by watching my parents, and then I think by we haven't talked much about my father, who's again has got really good sides to him, but
was very dysfunctional, deeply dysfunctional,
and maybe for obvious reasons, but with a partner who would never sleep with him, but. He went through 5 wives.
He kept
which is some effort.
It's also optimistic.
Some effort. Yeah. So I don't know that my image.
Yeah.
I think I associated marriage. To me, it was a bad word, not a good word.
There's no reverence or holiness or sacredness attached to it.
Yeah, and obviously I understand that's not the case for other people. But I think Debra had her parents broke up as well. And so maybe she had a sense of that too, that it didn't sing romance and little birdies in the trees to us.
I just, one of the threads running through this book, or one of the strong threads, is your relationship with Debra. And I just, there are certain marriages and relationships I look to and hold up on a bit of a pedestal. And I'd have to say that yours and Debra's is one of those.
Well, I just think you have to be on the same team, and there's that terrible, slightly sexist expression, happy wife, happy life. But if you remove the gender from it and say
happy partner,
it doesn't
happy
rhyme.
life.
It doesn't rhyme anymore. But happy partner, and I think that's not to say we don't have terrible fights all the time. We have screaming matches sometimes, but I think in the end you've got to. No relationship works unless you realise that your happiness is bound up in each other's happiness. And if they're not satisfied, and if they're not happy, if they're not in a good place, there's no way that you can achieve happiness. And you watch some relationships, and it almost seems as if they're in the opposite thing, that the more unhappy they can make each other, if they can win the battle, they're triumphant. Well, it's a very false victory. It's a very false victory. If you've managed to convince your wife or your husband that they really are, a bad person, they did the wrong thing and they were in the wrong, mental state, and they caused this argument, and they caused this argument because they're that sort of person who causes arguments, and you've won that debate through your verbal facility or maybe even your access to the truth. What exactly have you achieved by that?
That's profound.
What exactly have you achieved by your victory there?
Yeah, that's very, very true. And what
because
you say
your happiness is inextricably tied up with each other's happiness.
And I think once you're a parent, your happiness not perhaps for your mother, which is so interesting, but I would say that's the same of your children. There's a saying: you're only as happy as your unhappiest child.
Yeah. right.
And I would say that's probably true for you, but was not true of your mother.
And look, this is not to say that, of course, some people are in relationships so terrible, or the children are in a place so terrible, it is beyond your reach. Of course that's true. And I think it's really important for anyone who has a functional relationship to understand how lucky they are.
Yes.
That there's an enormous amount of luck in these things, that you've found a good person and you've changed each other in good ways, and that time has not taken one of you off into a bad place for various reasons outside maybe even their control. So there's a lot of luck in this. But there is some good management, and the good management is understanding that your happiness is bound up with each other's.
And I think your stories and your book is very much a tale of both of those things. The book is called Flesh Wounds. It is absolutely brilliant, Richard. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
Thanks. Thanks for this amazing hour.
Thank you. Thanks, Mia.
Richard Glover's new book, Flesh Wounds, is available now, published by HarperCollins. Thanks for listening to the No Filter podcast series. You can catch other episodes where I interview Lisa Wilkinson, Georgie Gardner, Koshi, Rosie Waterland, and many others. Subscribe in iTunes for more episodes, and you can find out more about this podcast on the Mamamia Podcast Network's Facebook page. We have a bunch of podcasts, all featuring smart, funny women. Or you can find out more on my own Facebook page, Mia Friedman Online. You can contact the show via Twitter @Mamamia Podcasts, or by emailing podcast@mamamia.com.au. This podcast was produced by Monique Bowley, researched by Eliza Ratliff, and hosted by me, Mia Friedman. Catch you next time.